War plans are often written with confidence. Timetables are drawn, maps are marked, and victory is calculated like a mathematical certainty. But sometimes war ignores the numbers. In the summer of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Army believed it was about to complete another rapid campaign. The objective seemed straightforward: cross the Owen Stanley Mountains, capture Port Moresby, and bring Australia within striking distance of Japanese air power. Japanese planners believed the advance across the mountains could be completed quickly, in a matter of days. They had every reason to believe it. The Japanese war machine had swept through Asia with terrifying speed. Malaya had fallen in around 70 days. Singapore collapsed in just over a week. The Dutch East Indies were conquered in 3 months. Rabaul had been taken almost effortlessly. For years, across campaign after campaign, Japan had advanced with remarkable speed and had rarely faced a serious land setback in the Pacific. The unit chosen for the task was among the most feared formations in the Imperial Army, the Nankai Shitai, the South Seas Force. These were not recruits. They were veterans, hardened soldiers who had already crushed resistance across the Pacific. Guam, New Britain. Every operation had ended the same way: swift, decisive victory. Standing in their path were only a few hundred Australian militia soldiers. Many had never seen real combat. Some were barely 18 years old, only recently out of training. When Major General Tomitaro Hori reviewed the intelligence reports on these defenders, he reportedly gave them only brief attention before setting them aside. Japanese accounts from the period suggest he and his staff were dismissive, confident that militia boys with outdated equipment posed no serious obstacle to veterans who had humiliated far larger and better equipped forces. He could not have been more wrong. A prediction shattered. Within weeks, Japanese field reports began describing the resistance in language rarely used about Allied troops earlier in the war. Words like fanatical, words like suicidal resistance, words like incomprehensible tenacity. 5 weeks after the campaign began, Hori himself would be dead, swept away crossing a river during a withdrawal he had never anticipated making. The operation, meant to last 10 days, took 131, and those 400 young militia soldiers did more than slow the Japanese advance. They broke its momentum, they bled one of the most powerful armies on earth, and forced it to retreat across the same mountains it had crossed with flags and confidence just months before. What Japanese commanders later wrote about those Australians, inside reports that Tokyo reportedly attempted to suppress before the war ended, tells a story that should have reshaped how the world understood what happened in New Guinea. But to understand it, we first need to look at the world as it stood in July 1942. Because at that moment, Australia was losing the war, Australia's last door. 5 months earlier, Singapore had fallen. Tens of thousands of Allied soldiers, among them a large number of Australians, had marched into captivity in what became one of the greatest military surrenders in British history. Darwin had been bombed. Japanese submarines had even probed Sydney Harbour. The defensive barrier across the Pacific was fracturing at every point. And now Japan was moving toward New Guinea. If New Guinea fell, the path to Australia itself would lie open. This wasn't theory, it was geography. Port Moresby sat on the southern coast of New Guinea, less than 500 miles from Queensland. Whoever controlled that city controlled the air approaches across the Coral Sea. Whoever controlled those approaches could strike directly at Australian cities. Everyone understood the stakes. The Japanese understood them. General Douglas MacArthur understood them. The problem was simple: who was available to stop them? The answer was almost nobody. Australia's most experienced divisions, the battle-hardened 6th and 7th, veterans of the North African desert and the siege of Tobruk, were thousands of miles away in the Middle East. Political pressures kept them there longer than the situation in the Pacific could comfortably afford. American forces in Australia were still months away from being ready for serious offensive action. What remained in New Guinea were scattered militia units, reservists, part-time soldiers, weekend warriors as the phrase went. The regular army had a nickname for them: chocos, short for chocolate soldiers, the implication being that they would melt when the heat of battle found them. By August 1942, no one was laughing at the nickname anymore. The Kokoda Track. The unlucky unit tasked with holding the line was the 39th Australian Infantry Battalion. It was composed largely of young men from Victoria and New South Wales. Their average age was 18. Some had been in uniform for less than 3 months. Their equipment was a mix of outdated and inadequate, much of it not far removed from the previous war. They had no jungle training worth the name, no armor support, and almost no air cover. and they were ordered to march into one of the harshest landscapes on the face of the earth, the Kokoda Track. Most people, hearing the name, imagine a jungle trail, something difficult but manageable. In reality, it was a vertical nightmare. The track climbed from near sea level to almost 7,000 feet, through mountains wrapped in dense tropical rainforest. Sunlight barely reached the jungle floor. The mud could reach your knees in the dry season, and considerably higher during the rains. Malaria was not a risk, it was a certainty. Dysentery spread through every unit. Scrub typhus, tropical ulcers that ate through flesh to the bone, leeches on every exposed surface. The trail itself was often barely wide enough for one man, carved along cliff faces where a single misstep could send a soldier into a ravine no rescue party could reach. Some stretches climbed thousands of feet in less than a mile. Australian veterans who survived the campaign later struggled to convey what it was actually like. The descriptions that have come down, climbing endlessly in suffocating heat while soaking wet, carrying a load that grew heavier with every hour, don't quite capture the physical toll. The track did not simply tire men, it broke them down systematically, over days, and it was here that 400 militia boys were expected to stop an empire. First contact. The Japanese force advancing along the track was formidable by any measure. Horie had personally organized his battalions for the operation. The 144th Infantry Regiment formed the core. Veteran formations hardened by years of fighting in China and across the Pacific Theater. Supporting them were mountain warfare specialists, engineers, and artillery crews, dragging disassembled mountain guns through jungle that resisted every form of movement. Eventually, close to 10,000 Japanese soldiers would enter the campaign. Their intelligence told them the defenders were poorly trained militia. At first, they believed it. The first serious clash came on July 23, 1942, near the village of Kokoda. Around 120 Australians under Major William Owen held positions around a small airstrip, the only flat ground in the area and the only means of supplying the men on the track. Horie's forward troops attacked at night, expecting the kind of sudden collapse they had seen from other defenders elsewhere in the Pacific. A bayonet charge, a broken line, a rout. Instead, they met prepared positions and men who held them. Owen moved along the defensive line, directing fire and steadying soldiers who had never been in combat before. The fighting descended quickly into close-range savagery, bayonets, rifle butts, hand-to-hand in total darkness on a jungle plateau. Owen was shot and died within hours, but his men did not break. By dawn, the Japanese had taken the airstrip, but the price had surprised their commanders, and the Australians had not surrendered, had not scattered. They had slipped back into the jungle, regrouped, and begun setting ambushes on the track behind them. This was not the pattern Japanese commanders had seen before. They were beginning to take notice. Reinforcements arrive. In late August, the character of the fight began to change. Fresh troops reached the front. The 214th and 216th battalions of the Australian Imperial Force, AIF volunteers, marched into the jungle to relieve what was left of the militia units. These were not teenagers in their first campaign. These were men who had fought in the Western Desert, who had endured the siege of Tobruk, who understood sustained combat in ways that even their own army had underestimated. When they saw the condition of the militia boys they were relieving, the sickness, the wounds, the look of men who had been pushed far beyond any reasonable limit, the reaction, by multiple accounts, was not pity, it was fury and respect. Brigadier Arnold Potts took command of the Australian forces along the track, and what he began conducting would later be recognized by military historians as one of the more skillfully executed fighting withdrawals of the Pacific War. It was not a rout, it was not panic. It was a controlled retreat, designed to inflict maximum attrition on the advancing Japanese while keeping the Australian force intact for the moment when conditions allowed the tide to turn. The Japanese did not understand this. They believed they were winning cleanly. The last ridge. By early September, Japanese communications suggested growing optimism. Horie signaled to headquarters that Port Moresby would soon be in their hands. Forward units were close enough to the southern coast that some accounts suggest they could make out the distant shimmer of the sea on clear days. Then the Australians stopped retreating. They halted at Irabiwa Ridge, the last defensible ground before the coastal plain leading to Port Moresby. Only 30 miles separated them from the town. There was no more track behind them, no more mountains to fall back into. Beyond this point lay Australia itself. And then something happened that stunned the South Seas force. The Australians attacked, Not a probe, not a limited counterstroke. A full assault, bayonets fixed. Pushing straight back up the same track they had spent 2 months fighting their way down. The 25th Brigade, reinforced by fresh units, drove forward with a ferocity that Japanese accounts struggled to characterize. The communications back to Rabaul changed in tone almost immediately. Enemy has launched major counterattack. Forward positions overwhelmed. Request permission to consolidate. Consolidate was the polite term for retreat. Permission was denied. The Imperial Army did not retreat. That was doctrine. That was ideology. But the Australians were no longer particularly interested in Japanese doctrine. They kept coming. The Japanese collapse. The fighting during the Australian counter-offensive was among the most brutal sustained combat of the entire Pacific War. Battles erupted on ridgelines, so narrow that organized formations meant almost nothing. The advantages of experience and numbers that the Japanese had carried into the mountains became increasingly difficult to apply in terrain that reduced everything to individual acts of violence in close quarters. The Australians climbed slopes the Japanese had previously descended, fighting through positions still marked by the dead from earlier engagements. Gradually, the Japanese line fractured, not in one dramatic collapse, ridge by ridge, unit by unit. The Nankai Shitai, once among the most feared formations Japan had fielded, began falling back, first to Templeton's Crossing, then to Eora Creek, then back toward Kokoda itself, the same villages they had occupied just months before with total confidence. The retreat grew desperate quickly. Soldiers stumbled along the track, starving, sick and wounded. Supplies that had moved forward with the advance were now impossibly far behind the retreating columns. Men who could no longer walk were sometimes left where they fell. There were not enough healthy soldiers remaining to carry them. Japanese diaries and letters recovered after the campaign described the disintegration in terms that were difficult to reconcile with the army that had entered the mountains in July. The physical suffering was total. The psychological collapse was equally profound. One such account, among the documents recovered after the campaign, captured something that went beyond tactical analysis. The writer, a lieutenant somewhere on the retreat, described his army's confusion in facing an enemy that had absorbed everything thrown at it and then simply refused to stop. He wrote that the Australians seemed to fight for something he could recognize but not name, something personal, something connected to the ground beneath them in a way that Japanese soldiers fighting thousands of miles from their own homes could not fully match. Whether that was the precise insight of one man or a sentiment shared across many, the captured documents from the campaign returned to the same theme repeatedly. These soldiers were different, and the Japanese had not been prepared for them. The jungle turns. The retreat became a disaster with no flaw. The same mountains that had punished the Australians advancing forward now destroyed what remained of the South Seas force moving backward. But the crucial difference was supply. The Australians had been retreating toward their lines. The Japanese were retreating away from theirs. Every step backward carried them farther from food, ammunition, and medicine. Starvation spread through the ranks. Men ate whatever the jungle offered. Disease moved through units that no longer had the physical reserves to resist it. Soldiers who had crossed the Owen Stanley Mountains as the most feared jungle infantry in the Pacific were now barely capable of sustained movement, and behind them came the Australians, cutting off rearguards, closing escape routes, applying the same relentless forward pressure the Japanese had built their early victories upon. General Horii never made it out. On November 19, 1942, attempting to cross the flooded Kumusi River on a makeshift raft during the retreat, he was swept away by the current. His body was never recovered. The general who had been promised a 10-day campaign died in a river, fleeing a battlefield he had entered with total confidence just 4 months earlier. The number that matters. In the end, the Kokoda Campaign came down to numbers. Japan committed close to 10,000 soldiers to the operation. More than 6,000 became casualties, killed in action, wounded or dead from disease. Entire battalions that had been battle-hardened across years of campaigning ceased to exist as fighting units. The 144th Infantry Regiment, which had seized Guam in less than 2 days, was shattered beyond recovery. Australian losses were severe, 625 killed, more than 1,600 wounded, but they held, without tanks, without meaningful artillery support, often without reliable food or medicine, sick with malaria, exhausted to the edge of collapse, watching men they knew die in mud that swallowed their boots, and the 10 days promised by General Horii became 131. When the fighting ended, the Japanese were not in Port Moresby. They were buried in the jungle, or lost in its rivers, or scattered across ridgelines that would bear the marks of what happened there for years afterward. What the Japanese learned. Japanese records revealed something that tends to receive less attention than the campaign itself deserves. Kokoda permanently changed how senior Japanese commanders assessed Australian soldiers. Before the campaign, the prevailing view within the Imperial Army was that Australians were essentially British colonial troops, capable perhaps, but shaped by the same institutional caution that had seen British forces consistently outmaneuvered in Malaya and Singapore. After Kokoda, that assessment disappeared from the record. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, one of the architects of Japan's Southeast Asian victories, reviewed the campaign reports and produced an assessment that was striking in its directness. He observed, according to post-war accounts of his writings, that the Australian soldier was not simply a British soldier in a different uniform, that he fought according to a different logic, one rooted in something immediate and personal, rather than in institutional obligation. Japanese operational instructions issued for subsequent engagements in New Guinea reflected this reassessment directly. Expect aggressive close-range combat. Expect sudden attacks without warning. Do not assume that pressure will produce withdrawal. These instructions came directly from Kokoda. And in every major engagement that followed, at La Salamawa, Buna, Gorna, Shaggy Ridge, Wewak, Japanese reports returned to the same observation. The Australians came closer. They stayed longer. And they did not stop. Why they fought. Yet the truth of Kokoda was never written by generals or staff officers. It was written by the young men who stood on that track in the first place. The militia boys of the 39th Battalion had no idea they were making history. They did not know that Japanese officers were cabling stunned reports back to Rabaul about them. They did not think of themselves as the defenders of a continent. They only knew the enemy was coming, and behind them was home. Private Stan Bissett, 18 years old, spoke for many of them when he described the experience years later. They were scared, he said. They were sick. Men were dying around them, and half the time they had no clear idea of what they were supposed to do next. But there was nowhere to go back to, and behind them was everything that mattered. That was the force the Japanese ran into on the Kokoda Track. Not superior weapons, not better tactics, not any advantage that a planning document could have identified or a staff officer could have prepared for. Just a group of young Australians who decided the enemy would not pass. Japan wanted 10 days. It got 131. It wanted Port Moresby. Instead, it found the Kumusi River. And the reports that Japanese officers wrote afterward, filled with words like fanatical and incomprehensible and unstoppable, remain the most honest record of what actually happened there. Because 400 young Australians proved something in the mud and darkness of the Owen Stanley Mountains. Even powerful armies can be halted. If the people standing in its way have nowhere left to go,